Hi, everybody.
We got it. Okay. Welcome to Bee School number 2 by the Harvard undergraduate beekeepers. Of course, we couldn't do it without all the other members of our beekeeping empire, which I'm so glad to see all of you today. So we started with bees and bee biology. Now we're moving to actually beekeeping. So the history of the practice, sort of what beekeeping is all about. And then if you stick with us in 2 more weeks, we'll be doing the 3rd and final lecture on actually how to do beekeeping. So we'll be learning sort of the ins and outs, the really technique, practice-oriented stuff. But we're going to start out with a beekeeping overview. Arrow keys if you'd like.
Okay. Before we begin that, we wanted to address some questions that people had last time at the end of class survey. One of which was, how do I plant 4 bees in my garden? And this is a very interesting question. This is something the club is hoping to get into eventually once spring rolls around. But in general, there's not a whole lot of wrong ways to do it, but there are certain plants that are better adapted for bee pollination. And evolutionary biologists have this thing called pollination syndromes, which is essentially certain flowers have a suite of characteristics that suggest that they're more likely to be pollinated by certain kinds of pollinators as opposed to others. We have a chart on the next slide, but you can imagine that flowers that open at night might be more inclined to be pollinated by bats or moths. Flowers with very deep nectaries might be hummingbird pollinated. So there are certain flowers that are more interesting to bees, so to speak. And we have a few examples down here, but you could always, and we also included a link at the end that has a very large Wikipedia list of North American flowers that are subject to this bee pollination syndrome. Another thing that you could do is you should time your blooms throughout the season bees are active. So bees around this part are active in the spring, summer, and fall. So if you have different flowers such that your garden is always in bloom at some point during these months, then that's probably the best thing you could do. And this chart up here shows some bulbs you could plant, and you'd probably want to get some from early spring, summer, and fall, so that there's never really a period where there are no blossoms, in which case the bees can't really use your garden. Another thing you should do is avoid hybrids. A lot of flowers are hybridized for their horticultural value, and they just look very nice, but the problem is they're not very sexually productive, and bees who need the pollen, well, they can't get as much from hybrids as they can from a non-hybrid flower. And this is another point to mention that a lot of people don't think about, but bees need water too. So even if you don't have a garden, supplying water for bees is a fantastic thing you could do. Bees love bird baths, for instance, and some people will put stones in their bird baths so the bees can stand on them, lean over, and drink water. So if you have even just a small space on your windowsill or something, or outside if you have a bird bath, that's a good idea. We have some examples down here. And a full disclaimer, I'm not that much of a gardener myself, but in my research, these are some crops that are good for growing. For herbs, if you choose to let them flower, I know a lot of people who grow herbs will cut the flowers. But if you choose to, mint, basil, sage, thyme, oregano is good. If you're growing sort of a crop garden, then cucumber flowers, tomatoes, melons, strawberries, everything up there is good. And if you're going for strictly ornamental flowers, the list is huge. If you're really curious about this, I would recommend you take a look at the recommended reading at the end of this, because it has just this extremely large list. But in general, any plant, or flower rather, that demonstrates traits that are attractive to bees, which we'll just get into in a minute, are good to plant. And here it is. Here's the chart that shows these pollination syndromes, and the bees are highlighted in yellow. So for color, flowers that are white, yellow, blue, or ultraviolet, bees can't see ultraviolet colors, are good. Bees don't have receptors to see red, so red flowers aren't necessarily that attractive. Nectar guides, what this means is that some flowers will have different patterns of coloration, particularly often in the ultraviolet spectrum, that can guide bees to where the nectar is. As for odor, fresh, mild, pleasant, compared to putrid for flies. Nectar usually present. Sticky pollen, that would make sense. And flower shape, shallow. Some have a landing platform like those snapdragons in the top right. Bees can land on those and reach in and get the pollen and nectar. Tubular and C, I'm not quite sure what C is, but that's a brief overview of what. Calyx? Who knows? Anyway, this is a nice chart. And we had another question, which is, how do I spot health issues in the hive? And the answer to that is come to next class, which we'll be talking about how to spot health issues in the hive. In general, just on a broad scale, spotting issues in the hive is a matter of recognizing what's normal, and then when something changes from what's normal, there may be a problem there. But there's a whole wide variety of issues that could happen in the hive, which we will cover in more detail in the next class.
So this is our roadmap for what's going to be going on for the rest of the presentation. We're going to start off with products and services. I know you're all wondering, what can bees do for me? Sure, they're cool. Sure, they're interesting. But what can I get out of this? So we're going to talk about the products and services of beekeeping. We're going to do a little bee history. We're going to talk about hive designs with the Extreme Hive Makeover. Tools of the trade. So all the tools a beekeeper needs to be successful.
And we brought some in.
We brought in props to demonstrate. We're going to do a little talk on just sort of managing a hive and working with it. And then last and most important, please don't die. We're going to talk about safety and how to not die when you're keeping bees, because this is generally important. Okay, so why do people keep bees? Well, generally, some people keep bees because they like them, but in general, humans get really great things from bees. Honey is obviously the thing that comes to most people's heads first. Historically, it's been just incredibly important. For a very long time, it was the only sweetener available to humans. It's ridiculously antimicrobial and lasts for just hundreds of years if you keep it in proper conditions. The honey in burial jars I have on the picture there would still be good to eat if it weren't preserving human organs. But if it were just in those jars, it would still be good to eat. It is incredibly antimicrobial.
Now, supposedly, this might be a bit apocryphal, but I believe that honey supposedly has all of the ingredients necessary for life, I've heard. How true that is, dubious. But it does have a substantial amount of sugars, it has water present, it has amino acids.
And finally, whether it's used as a sweetener or an actual base, you can do a lot of fermenting with honey. So you can fortify other things you're fermenting or just make straight mead. Pollination is another huge service that bees do, especially in modern times. Probably a large chunk of beekeepers' paychecks come from pollination services. So honeybees aren't necessarily the best pollinators, but they're the ones that we can move around in semi-trucks the easiest. So in that sense, it kind of becomes this multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry that really supports a lot of the food we consume and a lot of the most nutritious food we consume. We'll definitely talk more about that in the last lecture. But yeah, suffice to say, bees are really important pollinators, if not ecologically, certainly anthropologically. And finally, wax, or I guess I have another page. Wax is incredibly important, more so earlier in history when it was kind of a primary fuel. You had candles, you had wax being used in cosmetics, and you can do art. Even today, is still a tremendously important material. And then some of the more interesting ones, propolis, which is something a lot of people don't really know about. This is essentially bee glue. It's the caulk that they use to stick together all the parts of their hives. So when bees are making natural hives, they'll make everything watertight, airtight, using this sticky substance. And you can see it in the picture. It's this orange mass. And you can see the beekeeper has pried off the lid, and it's so sticky, it's kind of pulled up in these sheets. Propolis is an amazing substance. It's part secretions from the bee itself and part organic compounds that they collect in nature from things like pine resin. And it's absolutely crazy antimicrobial. So it's antibacterial, antifungal. It's actually used in a lot of cultural medicines, not so much in the West, but a lot in the East. Russia is really important. Propolis is sometimes called Russian penicillin, which is a little bit of a goofy name. But you can make ethanol and glycerol tinctures fairly easily. And these are used for things like sore throats, stomach disorders, cuts and burns. It's a general antibacterial. And then we have quirky things like bee venom. This is kind of a niche thing. The little collection device I have on the lower right, it's actually a electrified sheet of glass, and when the bees step on it, they get angry and sting it, and it collects venom. Apparently, this is used in cosmetics to put on your face to make you more youthful. And then there's other uses that are kind of just now starting to come on with kind of homeopathic medicine. You can use bee venom to treat things like arthritis and other hard to reach bacterial infections like Lyme disease, where your body's immune system isn't really good at taking those things out. So you can use apparently concentrated shots of bee venom. Seems cool. I don't know. I'd try it. This is speaking on propolis, this is a preparation I did as part of a fungal biology class. So you see in the center, there's a spore inoculation. This is on a petri dish. And the fungal growth has grown all out from that center. And you see it's excluded where the propolis is. On the other side, there's a negative control, so it's just like a petroleum jelly that's sitting there. Fungus has no trouble growing over that, but it's totally stopped by the propolis. So it's a fun little experiment. You want to talk about history?
You start. I'll talk about my favorite one, Mesoamerica.
So long story short, I did a report on beekeeping in ancient Egypt, so I know way too much. I'll just share a little bit. But the first recorded beekeepers, or at least the first people who wrote about beekeeping, were the Maltese. They had these sort of cave hives that you see in the picture here. I'm sure a lot more is known about them. I don't know a lot about them. I've studied more beekeeping in the Levant in ancient Egypt. So this is incredibly old, dating back to like the 3rd dynasty. This is like 8000 BC. People slowly transitioned from just robbing hives in nature to actually keeping them. And the Egyptians used these sort of clay cylindrical hives that you can see pictured in the relief on the lower left. They understood a fair amount about bee biology. They knew there was a specific bee, the queen, that was important for the hive staying alive. They used smoke, which you can actually see in the relief, which is pretty cool. And they kept bees because honey was extremely important. It had significant religious value. Bees were actually known as the tears of Re. So they were literally part of the sun god. And honey was really important for taxation and for temple offerings. So they actually had this big bureaucratical organization of beekeepers where you had like regional managers and accountants and people that were keeping track of beekeepers all over a region to extract a quota of honey for the temple. So it wasn't as much of a hobby then as I think a lot of people think of it now. And for the Egyptians, at least, honey was their only source of sweetener. So it was if you were going to use it to eat, it was a really like elite food. Not your average everyday person would eat it all the time. And then finally, it had some serious religious significance in burial rites. So there's a lot of tombs where you find body parts and like stillborns and miscarriages preserved in honey. It had a lot of religious value when it comes to the afterlife. And to speak a little bit on Africa and Asia, so you have transition from wild bee, sort of bee hunting, bee harvesting, to actually beekeeping practices. There are still tribes in Africa today that go out and find wild bees, but there are plenty of people that keep bees and even keep bees commercially. When I was in Uganda, I was catching wild bees with the people there and keeping them. There are different parts of the world where they cultivate different species and different subspecies of honeybees. So the Asiatic honeybee is a different species and it's cultivated in Southeast Asia. And there's also another subspecies in Nepal that's really interesting because they have these cliff-dwelling bees and thus beekeepers that actually get up on the cliffs and deal with them. So this is absolutely incredible. There's tons of things in National Geographic about these cliff-dwelling beekeepers.
Yeah, we included an article, this phenomenal article, in the recommended reading about modern-day beekeepers who do this. If you read anything from the recommended reading, you should read that. It's really cool.
It's really incredible. They have a lot of special spiritual connection with the beekeeping practices and who's actually allowed up on the cliffs to interact with the bees. It's not everybody. You have to be of a certain spiritual status in the community. And then these bees also harvest nectar from rhododendrons, or at least the rhododendrons in the area, which have hallucinogenic compounds. So you get this red honey, which is apparently mildly hallucinogenic. And then finally, kind of fun factoid, in the war in Vietnam, the Viet Cong would keep killer bees on trails to as sort of like live booby traps for people going by. And then there was counter research in U.S. Black Ops with trying to breed hyper killer bees to send into camps and things. There's a pretty interesting history of bees and warfare that stretches all the way back to ancient Greece, but that was a little bit on that. You want to talk about
Yeah,
the
sure.
next
Now,
point?
for my area of expertise, what's really interesting about beekeeping is it's not strictly an old world invention. Even over in the New World, before they had the actual Apis genus that we were talking about, they kept bees, particularly the Maya, and they called them the Shuhun Kab, which means royal lady. And this was a kind of stingless bee. The honey supposedly tasted different. I think it was more savory than sweet or something like that. But this was seen as not only a sacred food and medicine and used as a sweetener because the Maya did not have other sweeteners to sweeten like cacao drinks and things like that. They'd use honey instead of sugar. But it was so valuable that it was used as a form of currency as well. The economy around there was somewhat barter system based. Probably the main unit of money would be a cacao bean, but traded to somewhat of a relative frequency as that was honey as well. And in fact, when the conquistadors arrived, one of the first things they demanded of the Mayan villages was they would have to ship back tons, literally tons of honey back to Spain, which I just find super interesting because this practice arrived in more than two, just various places all over the world using different species. What about Europe?
Yeah, so then the final beekeeping culture we're going to touch on is Europe. And I just love this painting because medieval artists don't know how to draw and everything looks all goofy, and I love it. But Europe was really big on the breeding and domestication of bees. So if you think about what you would call an African or Africanized bees, these are like the wild Apis mellifera that's native to the Mediterranean and northern Africa. It's sort of like wolves to dogs in the sense that the bees we keep today have been bred for generations and generations to be more docile, to produce more honey, etc. So there's this culture in Europe of taking and breeding queens and keeping this sort of bred population of bees rather than always capturing them from the wild. Mead is extremely important, especially in Northern Europe. And in the medieval times, beekeeping was mostly relegated to monasteries and abbeys. So there was also, kind of unsurprisingly, a religious connection, just like there is in Mesoamerica and Egypt, Africa. And another kind of fun fact, there are several cities spread around Europe that are called some variation of Bee Town or Bee City. It's a story that happens over and over, where you have a city that was supposedly defended by dropping beehives on invaders from the walls of the cities. So there's also a civil defense aspect of beekeeping in medieval Europe. And after the medieval and Renaissance times, beekeeping takes a real turn with this guy, Langstroth, inventing the Langstroth hive, which really changes beekeeping from this, where you have a wicker hive that has to be destroyed every time you want to harvest honey. So you have hives that only last at most 1 year, to a hive that can basically just last forever as you move bees in and out of it. So this is the real turn in beekeeping history that gets us to something a lot more like what we see today. So that brings us to hive designs. There's lots and lots of different ways to keep bees. Because they're evolved to nest in natural structures, they're really adaptive. So we have, I don't have any pictures of these, but supposedly the first beehives were sort of these hollowed out logs or even mud shaped into logs. And this is sort of similar to the cylindrical clay hives that you would see in Egypt and the Levant, where you have a really easy to produce simple hive structure that has to be destroyed every time you harvest honey. More popular in Europe were called skep hives, which are these wicker baskets. I know Greg has sort of like an imitation of one of these, which is really cool that we bring around as a prop, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it today. So the problem, or I guess you could consider one of the problems with these hives, is they have to be destroyed every time you want to harvest honey. So the first step to get away from that are frames inside hives, which starts with a top bar hive, which I'll have more pictures of later, but in the lower right is sort of a modern version of a top bar hive, where it's horizontal, bars are arranged across, and the bees draw their comb off the bars. So then you can actually get into the hive, remove comb without destroying the entire structure. And then variations on this idea come in the form of the Langstroth hive, the Ware hive, which you see up on the upper left. That's more of a vertical top bar hive, where you have boxes stacked on top of each other that are still top bars. This is used in Japan. The particular Ware hive is a more recent German invention. It's not as popular as the Langstroth, but just another variation. And then we'll show a couple of pictures of really fancy, modern Kickstarter hobby hives, which are always really entertaining. I don't know, we love them.
Yeah, as far as the modern world is concerned, these three classes of hives, the top bar, the Ware, and the Langstroth, are kind of the triad that you'll see around the world most frequently. People are trying to push these hobby hives, but we have some pictures of them too. Right, here we go.
Yeah, so up in the upper right, that's actually one of the top bar hives that I was working with in Uganda. And in the lower right, that's a top bar from one of these. So it's called a top bar because literally all there is a single bar that the bees then draw a comb down from. So there's no foundation, there are no guides. It's sort of relying on the bees to just sort of naturally do their thing. In the middle there, in green, is actually a temperature sensor, which is part of the research I was doing. In the lower left, you have a Langstroth hive, or a diagram of a Langstroth hive. These are really important, and we'll get to them in just a second. Above, you have sort of a variation on the Langstroth hive. People might recognize this as the flow hive. So this is one of those fancy kickstarted things. Not terribly... It seems just very inconvenient to have honey just kind of flowing around.
Yeah, I think like the premise is that you could just turn a valve and immediately harvest the honey by just like shearing off the capping on their supers, essentially. But it's questionable.
If you're like a backyard beekeeper with maybe 2 or 3 hives, this seems like it could be feasible. But if you're going to want to keep any more than that, you're going to have really big problems with robbing and stuff. Although here there's a Flow Hive 2.0, so maybe they fix those problems, and I shouldn't be too harsh on them. And then I don't know what this is in the middle, but it looks wild.
Is that real? Is that real? Did you just find a Photoshop picture?
I found this on the internet. This is like a glass drop urban hive that apparently you'd have on the side of some skyscraper in downtown Boston. I don't know. I'd love to see it.
I hate to fall on my head.
This is my postmodern ideal, I guess, for the city.
But in general, the hive that at least the club focuses on the most, and a lot of beekeepers in America and the Western world focus on, is the Langstroth. And the Langstroth hive, we should first talk about bee space. So bees are extremely particular about how they want their space. I think they want a space of like 3/8 of an inch, is that right? Mm-hmm. So if they have a space of 3/8 of an inch between any two surfaces, they're happy with that. Anything smaller, they'll try to glue it together with propolis. Anything larger, they'll try to bring it together using comb. So you have to be very, very particular. And the idea behind the Langstroth hive is if you could maximize this in such a way that you could also work with the hive easily and maximize production, and the Langstroth hive is sort of born out of that. So the key with the Langstroth hive is you have these movable frames, and we brought one in here. And what they essentially do is, it's basically just a wooden box. It's not that fancy, but they'll hang down from these little lips here, and the bees can crawl around. And you'll have typically 8 or 10 of these frames stacked in one box. As a matter of fact, we can pass this around if you want to see one of these. And these frames are typically pre-built with a hardy wax foundation in the center that already has this hexagon arrangement to encourage them to develop comb in a certain way. In a sense, you could kind of think of it as like mass producing the normal frame, not the frame structure, like the comb structure that bees naturally create, but in such a way that the beekeeper is able to pick it up, move it to a different box, pick up the whole box, move it somewhere else to go harvest the honey or something like that. And so modularity is a really big important part of this. At different times in the season, you'll have different boxes on your hive. So typically the boxes on the bottom are known as deeps, or well, deep just refers to the size of them, but we call them brood boxes because that's where the bee brood is raised. When it's coming time to harvest honey, when the honey flows begin, you will add what's typically called a super, which is a smaller, well, a more stout box on top that has smaller frames that is designed just for honey to be stored in. And there's a way to get only the worker bees to go up there and not the queen, so she won't lay eggs. It's called the queen excluder, and that goes in between the deeps and the supers. And what else? And nukes. A nuke refers to a small colony, including a queen, that is typically branched off from a larger colony. They're one of two ways in general to start a new hive, is either to get a package of bees with a separate queen and introduce her there, or just have what is essentially a mini, fully functional hive. And they come in a separate box, essentially, that looks very much like a Langstroth box. I think it's, 5 frames?
Typically? Yeah, so it's the nuke box is, well, nuke is short for nucleus. It's like
we should clarify that. It does not come from what we all hope it does, nuclear weapons, but...
So the nuke box is basically exactly half of a deep. And you're just going to have a couple frames of brood, maybe a frame of honey, and then a queen and a few workers. So it's sort of the minimal amount you need to start a new hive.
Yeah, and as for some of the special equipment on these Langstroth hives, I mentioned a queen excluder, which is essentially just a fancy metal screen that you put between the brood box and the honey super to make sure the queen can't go up and lay eggs so you don't have bees in your honey. Feeders, there's a couple different designs of feeders, but if you want to supplement the bees' feeding with sugar water, typically you have entrance feeders, which is essentially just an inverted jar that you stick into the entrance of the hive, which would be towards the bottom there on top of the bottom board. You could also have top feeders, which you could put on top of the brood box and bees could go up there. And there's like a screen kind of dome. No, that's not a dome. But there's a screen that could climb up through, drink sugar water, come back down. There's various things you could do for insulation and ventilation, pest control, entrance reducers if you're trying to reduce robbing or block mice or something from coming in. And there's some very fancy electronic tools you could use to monitor, like temperature, things like that going on in the hive. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah. So yeah, these are basically all a bunch of equipment that's designed to work with Langstroth hives because it's the most popular design in the United States.
I figure we should probably walk through this diagram just very quickly. So at the very bottom of the hive, you have what's called the bottom board. That's where pretty much the entire hive is supported on top of. And sometimes you'll have like a little ramp entrance for bees to land and crawl in. Then above that, you'll have the brood box, which is one of these deeps, typically hanging 8 or 10 frames. In this one, they only have one brood box. If you have a particularly large hive, you could have more than one brood box. Then they have this screen, which is the queen excluder. And on top of that, they have the honey super, where the bees will go store honey. Then above that, they have what's called an inner cover. And the idea behind the inner cover is to create this dead space of air, correct? To essentially insulation purposes,
right?
Basically. And that will create an empty space for insulation between the inner cover and the roof, or the lid, which, is just a lid to keep snow or rain or whatever have you from falling on the hive.
So here's just a couple pictures from Langstroth land. So this is bee space. You can see they'll draw a comb from one side and then from the other side, and once they reach this magic distance, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but they'll leave that as like a crawl space for the bees. And it's very predictable, and it's used in the design of the Langstroth to keep everything working well. We have some of the electronic monitoring we talked about on the lower right. So that's just a temperature sensor that goes and sits inside the hive and monitors the temperature of the brood chambers, which the bees will keep at specific temperatures depending on what they're doing in there. And then finally, pretty much the main reason why the Langstroth is so popular is that it's modular and stackable, so you can move it around on trucks like you see there. Super robust, move move hives from field to field, move boxes from one hive to another. It's completely designed for scalability. So if you're going to be keeping thousands of hives, you basically need something that's a cube. It makes a lot of sense logistically. Okay, so tools. There aren't too many. Beekeepers are pretty humble. But there are a couple tools that are absolutely invaluable if you're going to be keeping bees. Firstly, protection. As we talked about, bees sting. It hurts. It's no fun. So we try to avoid it as much as possible. Most importantly are the veil or the suit. Getting stung in the hands or the arms a couple times isn't such a big deal. But taking stings to the face is never any fun at all.
And bees know where your face is. They know to hunt it out, so the veil is important. If there's any piece you should not visit the hive without, it's typically the veil.
So yeah, a veil is the most common thing that all wear. And then there are jackets, which is the veil plus a jacket over your torso, and a suit, which is what we see in the picture, which is your entire suit cover. These are a matter of preference and also a matter of sort of the job you're undertaking. And we'll talk more about that in the final lecture. But basically, depending on how intense and how pissed you're liable to make the bees, you're going to want different categories of protection. Gloves are often useful, depending on how comfortable you are at the hive. A lot of people, gloves make them feel more safe. Personally, I most of the time work the hive without gloves because it allows you to be more dexterous and to move things around more easily, and also sort of forces you to be careful with where you're putting your hands, where you're placing things, so you don't harm the bees and don't harm yourself.
Yeah, most of the gloves you see are typically these thick rubber canvas designs, and you cannot feel anything through them. So if you're crushing the bee, you won't notice until you've crushed the bee, and then that's going to piss everybody off. The alternative is not having gloves, which you get to feel everything and tend to be more gentle at the risk of being stung. There is an intermediate. Some people will use like latex gloves, which supposedly you could feel better, and the bees have a difficult time gripping to sting you through. I've never used them. Have you ever used them? But that's an idea that some people use.
And then for the most important tool is the titular hive tool. This is probably my favorite multi-tool ever invented. I've seen people use these for just about anything you can possibly imagine.
It's a crowbar.
It's a crowbar. I mean, you'd be surprised with what the functions like pry, prod, and scrape can really do for you.
Do you have one? Or did
I didn't bring one.
Oh, no. Well, it's not that hard to imagine. Just take a strip of metal and you basically have a hive tool.
Yeah, but it's I've seen people do car maintenance with these. Obviously, you can do a lot of things in the hive. We'll talk all about that later. And the bee smoker, which we brought one up here, is really important. So we smoke our bees because it stops us from getting stung, basically. It's a adaptation honeybees have for wildfires. So when they smell smoke, they basically prepare to move the hive in case the fire comes and overtakes the environment they're in. So this basically involves all the bees returning to the comb and gorging themselves on honey, so they can be full and bring, if they need to leave, bring as much of the resources with them as they can. This makes them really huge and lethargic, and it's hard for them to move around, so they're less likely to sting you, and they're also sort of more concerned with gorging themselves than protecting the hive or going out and stinging you. So a little bit of smoke will keep the bees kind of preoccupied as you do your thing. There also are some theories that it interferes with their pheromone communication. So that's sort of another advantage.
And these are pretty simple the way they work. Just in this design, which is probably the most ubiquitous design you'll see, you just light a fire in here. Essentially, we use burlap to do that. Close it up and just pump these bellows for a bit to get some smoke. That's ash. Ignore that. Don't breathe. Yeah, I probably should clean this one out. Anyway, does everybody want to come see this and pass it around?
Yeah, pass it around. It's cool.
Yeah.
And there's some really cool vintage smokers you can find on eBay probably. It's just it's an aesthetic tool. I like it.
Don't do it in your face though.
So there are other sort of niche kind of hobby tools that you can buy. But if you want to be sort of an economic beekeeper, these are the bare minimum required. All right. So once you have these tools, what do you do with them? So working the hive is the most important and the most fun thing a beekeeper can do, but there are definitely right and wrong ways to go about it. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the final class, but right now I'm just going to give a brief overview of sort of what you do when you come up to the hive. So bees, they're inside in total darkness. They don't really rely on their eyes very much, but they're extremely sensitive to vibrations. So as you're approaching the hive, you don't want to be tapping it on the side or bumping it around because it's going to make the bees angry really quickly.
The idea is if there's like a gentle knocking on your wall, it could be anything, but if somebody comes over and just kicks it really hard, that could be a bear. And that's why they freak out if there's a lot of vibration and noise.
And it's actually something you can use in the middle of winter if you don't want to open up your hives to see if they're home. You can just give the hive a slight tap and you'll literally hear them buzz back. They're extremely sensitive to vibration. So that means when you're working with the hive and you're moving frames around, setting things down, you really want to be gentle with and not knock things around because that'll really get the bees a lot angrier than they need to be. So we use the hive tool to pry open lids and move boxes around. The propolis that the bees use is extremely effective at sticking things together. So you need this pry bar to break open the joints, move things around. It can get really, really stuck together, and it can require a surprising amount of force to really tear things apart with the hive tool.
I think it's safe to say that a hive tool is probably as necessary as a veil, if not more, to work with the hive. They glue everything together. Like this frame we have here, all this gunk under these little lids here, this is propolis, and this will be stuck. So you have to put in the bar and twist it around and hear a snap and pull it out.
Yeah,
so it's a very laborious process.
You would basically not be able to even open a hive without the hive tool. Extremely important. So with your smoker lit, you just give a little bit of gentle smoke on the bees. Too much smoke will stress them out and ironically make them angrier and thus want to sting you more. So you want to keep it with just kind of a minimal amount of smoke. And generally the way you tell is as soon as you open up a hive, bees will come kind of bubbling or boiling out to really see what's going on because suddenly there's a bunch of light and it used to be dark. So if you give them a little smoke, they'll go back down inside the hive. So you can really tell how aggravated they are based on whether they're coming up and looking at you or down in the hive doing their own thing. And if you're using smoke and if you're kind of gentle and quick with things, you can almost do an entire hive check without the hive really even noticing you're there, which is absolutely ideal. So you always want to avoid crushing bees. There's a lot of moving parts and you're going to be moving boxes and setting them down, moving frames, setting them down. There's a lot of opportunity to accidentally crush bees. When they die, they release pheromones, which the other bees smell and kind of interpret as, of course, danger. Something's around killing bees. So if anything's going to piss them off the quickest, it's this. So you definitely want to be really careful, which is one of the reasons I like working in the hive without using gloves, because it makes you really aware of where the bees are. Because if you're going to crush a bee with your hand, you're going to get stung. So you're more aware of that. And finally, just a good word of warning, stay relaxed. It's kind of easy, especially if you don't have a lot of experience, to get really nervous when you're suddenly in a cloud of bees around your head and they're crawling all over you. In general, they're not angry, they're just checking you out. And who wouldn't? This is so. And the more upset you get, the more anxious the bees are going to get. So if you're moving around quickly, sweating, nervous, they'll pick up on this. You want to talk about the safety?
Sure. All right. So as Dylan mentioned, bees are most of the time surprisingly gentle. They do not want to sting you. And they're more curious of just exploring. But there are some circumstances that make bees more prone to being aggravated. These include rain, certain temperature ranges, particularly cold. They'll be upset if the hive's open, particularly hot as well. Dusk or dark is not a great time to do this. You should typically do this in the morning. Noise and vibration, like we mentioned, don't knock things around. Try not to be rough with the hive. That will upset them pretty easily. Quick movements along the same line, so don't like swat at bees. That will upset them. Nearby hives, yes, if you're in a big apiary and there are hives together, if one hive is upset, that tends to cause other hives to be upset. Stealing honey or crushing bees. Crushing bees, naturally, Dylan mentioned the pheromones, but stealing honey, naturally, that will upset them. That is their food source. And so there have been cases of if you are taking your honey super off the hive to go harvest honey, you need to make sure there are no bees following you, because they will follow you because they want to know where the food is going. So that's something you need to keep in mind. And they do smell your fear. I'll just leave it at that.
Like we talked, if you're nervous and sweating, they know what sweaty mammals smell like.
Yeah.
And it really aggravates them.
On the subject of smells, also avoid things like floral perfumes. They'll be really into that if you don't want them crawling all over you. Stuff like that.
The rain and dark is a really kind of surprisingly big one. There have been times where I'll be working hives and you're working 10 or 20 hives. Everything's going completely fine. The bees hardly even notice you're there. And then it'll start raining a little bit, and it's like it suddenly changes. Like you're just keeping totally different bees. Suddenly you're just getting stung left and right, and the bees are swarming all around you. So it's things like extreme cold, rain, or dark that they really view as threats that are really going to make them angry. So
kind of like us, if you think about it.
So if you ever find yourself in a situation like Nicolas Cage here,
I don't think anyone else is going to be in that situation, but
you do have to worry about allergies. I know, hopefully most people know whether they personally are allergic to bees or not, but sometimes you could be with somebody else or just have somebody else around in the area when you're keeping bees, and it's something you always want to be conscious of, because obviously some people are definitely allergic to bee stings. And even if some people think they're not allergic to bees, maybe if you've only been stung 1 or 2 times before, kind of out in the environment, when you're a beekeeper, you have the potential, hopefully none of us, but if you're keeping lots of bees or particularly aggressive bees, you have the potential to be stung dozens, hundreds of times, which is totally different to your immune system than just 1 or 2 stings. So I've definitely seen people who weren't allergic to bees get stung 30 times and suddenly have a pretty scary reaction. And finally, allergies can actually develop through exposure. So there have been stories of people starting off not allergic to bees, but after getting stung repeatedly over a lifetime, sort of developing an allergy through exposure. And also the reverse. So some people with sort of mild allergic reactions, those will actually diminish over time as you're exposed to the allergen. And so I just have some pictures. Benadryl or just any general antihistamine is really important, especially if maybe someone's not deathly allergic, but they get stung a couple times and start swelling, kind of feeling upset. Antihistamine is going to help with that. And then, of course, EpiPen for life-threatening situations. It's always great to have these. The club is getting them. I think any bee club should have several on hand, just for obvious reasons.
All right, well, that's the end of the slides. We do have a quiz, as usual. We also ran out of bee memes, so kind of insert your own mentally.